Hi, in this video we're going to look at how to group fields within a pivot table. Here is my database. Essentially it's showing transactions. I've got a date, the product sold, the quantity sold. I've actually got two price fields, I'll explain that later on, and I've got a revenue field. So we're going to look at how to group by date fields. We're going to look at grouping by numeric fields and look at grouping by text fields. This tutorial is going to kind of assume you're fairly familiar with creating pivot tables and adding fields to pivot tables. So let's get started. I'm going to click into my database. I'm going to go up to Insert on my ribbon, and then I'm going to select Pivot Table. So I want my pivot table to be placed on an existing worksheet location, which will be just here in H5. So I click on OK. So first of all, what I want to do is to be able to analyze this revenue per year, per month, per quarter, and if it's necessary, per week. So I'm going to add date as my rows value, and I'm going to add revenue as my value. Okay, now I'm in Excel 2016, and luckily for me, Excel 2016 automatically groups dates. So you can see I now have my dates grouped by year. And if I click on this little expand button here, I can see that year has been grouped by quarter and quarter has been grouped by month. And then I have a subtotal for each of those months within those quarters. And for within year, I have a subtotal for each of the quarters. Okay, now if you haven't got Excel 2016, your situation will look very much like this. If I just ungroup, you'll see that what will happen is the pivot table will just create a row heading for each date within your database. So I now have a sum of revenue for every date that appears in this database over here. Now what you would do to summarize your dates is very simply just right click into one of the date row headings and then just go to group here. This would open up the grouping dialog box, and here you can just choose how you want to group your dates. So we could say months and years. I didn't have to hold down Control or Shift to select years. I just click on the item that I want to group by. If I need to deselect an item, I just click on it again and it toggles it on and then back, toggles it off and then back on again. So anyway, click on OK. And now I have grouping by year and by month. Now, you can also adjust the grouping over here on your in your field list. If I just undo a couple of steps, so I go back to the grouping that I previously had in 2016, what I can do is look at these fields in the field list. You can see that I've got date as a field, I've got quarters as a field, and I've got years as a field. Now I only had one date field in my database, but because I've grouped dates, it actually creates two other virtual fields within my database. I've got years, and I've got, if I can just drag this up, I've got years, quarters, and date. Now date is actually month. What I can do is choose which of these groupings I want to keep. So for example, if I didn't want quarters, I'd just untick quarters. And then if I expand one of the years, just here, you can see that rather than showing quarters, I'm now showing months. Now there's lots of options for expanding, collapse and collapsing groupings within dates. If I right click on a year, I can go to expand and collapse, and I can say, for example, expand entire field, and that expands all the years, so I can now see all the months within those years. Equally, I can right click and I can collapse entire field. Okay, so that's grouping by dates. Easy if you're in Excel 2016 because it kind of does it for you automatically. If not, it's just a matter of changing the grouping settings either here, or if you remember, you can right click, go to group and changing the settings in here. One thing I will show you actually before we move on is how to group by weeks. Now if you notice in here, there is no week option within the list. Second, minutes, hours, days, months, quarters and years, but no weeks. Well, if you want to group by weeks, what you do is you unselect the other grouping options and go to days. And all you have to do is put in the number of days that you want to group by, so 7 for a week. The only thing you've got to think about really is what your starting date would be, and that would be the first day of the week that you want to group by. I'm not going to bother to work that out here, but that's something you'd have to think about. What will be your starting date? The first day of the week that contains a record form. Okay, so if I click on OK there, you can see what it does. It creates some nice little labels for me showing the date range. Okay, let's move on then. Let's move on to grouping by numeric field. So let's create another pivot table. Insert pivot table, and we're going to put it on the existing sheet again, and we'll start it up here in M5. So I click on OK. Now, grouping by numeric data. So what I'm going to try and do is show the number of sales within each price range. And this is, you'll see as we go through this why I've got two price fields. One contains integer values, and others in the other column contains decimal values. So I've got pence on each of these prices, but only pounds on these prices. And grouping by integer values differs slightly from grouping with decimal values. So anyway, let's use price 1 first of all as our row label. So I'm going to tick on that. This is the one with decimals. Actually, by clicking it there, because they're numeric values, it goes in the values area, whereas we want it to be in the row labels. Price 1 to be in the row labels, so I'm going to have to drag it in there. So you can see this is the version of the price with the pence, the decimal version. So what I'm going to do is put revenue into values. Now, I don't want to sum up the revenue, I want to count. So I'm going to right click, summarize values by count. So this is showing how many products were bought at each of these prices. But what would be more useful is to show the prices in price ranges. So I might have 10 to 15, 16 to 20, etc. So let's try this. Right click into one of our numeric values, go to group, and you can see the lowest and the highest value in my data. So I might as well start at 10, I think, and might as well end at 50. And I want my grouping interval to be £5. So click on OK. So it does some nice little grouping for me. But you might spot a problem here, and this is the problem you get when you're using decimal values, is that the ranges actually overlap. 10 to 15, 15 to 20. So if I had a item that was priced exactly £15, which grouping would represent that product? Well, it would actually be this product here, the higher range, 15 to 20. So although the lower value is included in the range, the higher value isn't, and that can be a little bit ambiguous. But what you can do, and I won't do it for all of the labels, but you can just overtype the labels that Pivot Table automatically gives you with something less ambiguous, just to make that crystal clear. Now let's do the same sort of thing, but using the integer version of the price. So again, I'll click into my pivot table, insert pivot table. Sorry, click into my table, insert pivot table, existing worksheet, and we're going across there. Let's just place it here. So click on OK. So this time I'm going to use price 2. So I'm going to drag that into rows. and I'm going to use the revenue again in values, right click, and what I want to do is go to summarize values by count. Now let's do some grouping here. So we right click into one of the price row headings, and we're going to go to group, and then we want to group 10 to 50, and we want our grouping interval to be by 5. So if I click on OK, you can see that this actually provides grouping labels that are not ambiguous: 10 to 14, 15 to 19, 20 to 24. So we don't need to do anything with that. But you can see these subtotals are exactly the same, whichever version we use. It's just the labels in this version were ambiguous. Okay, let's move on to grouping by text fields. So it might be useful, for example, you can see each of our products has a little brand label in front of it. We might want to create subtotals for sales for each of these brands. So let's click onto our table and create our last pivot table. So this is going to be over here under this little heading here. So click on OK. So what I want is I want product, so I can just tick on that. I'm going to rows, and revenue I'm going to put in values, and let's do a little bit of formatting on revenue. So right click on one of the values, number format, not format cells, number format, and I'm going to make that currency, no decimal places. So what I want to do is create some subtotals or some groupings for each of these brands. Now, the thing to do to group text values together is to select everything you want to exist within a group. So if they're consecutive values like they are here, because they're by default arranged in ascending order, all you have to do is select the first item, shift, select the last one. If they're non-consecutive items, which we don't have here, you would select the first one, control, select the others. So let me try that again. That's all come up. I'm not sure why that's come up. So you would select an item, and then you'd say control, select another item. You can see it selects non-consecutive items. We don't want that. We want to select consecutive items. So click on the first one, shift, click on the last one, right click, and go to group, and then it gives the group a fairly bland name, group 1, but you can type in your own label for that. Now it's actually, if you look at the other the remaining products, it looks like it's created an individual group for each individual product, but don't be put off by that. Let's select all of the City Kitsch products. So shift that, right click, group, and I'd call that City, and do all of them, but you get the idea. Deluxe, click on that one, shift, click on that one, right click, group, and I could call that Deluxe. Now I don't actually have any subtotals at the moment for the different brands, but that's easy to include. All I do is I go up to the design tab on my ribbon. I'll only see this design tab if I'm actually clicking to a pivot table, and then all I need to do is go over to subtotals on the left here, and I can say show subtotals at the top of group or bottom of group. I'm going to go for top, and there we are. I now have some subtotals for each of those brands. Okay, so that's hopefully helpful, showing you how to group different types of data, date fields, numeric fields, and text fields in a pivot table. Thanks very much for listening.